Ernesto Guevara, later known as Che Guevara, was born on June 14, 1928, in the city of Rosario, Argentina. He grew up in a relatively affluent family, with both parents, Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna, belonging to the Argentine upper-middle class. His father, an architect, was politically active and had a strong leftist inclination, which likely had a significant impact on young Ernesto's later political ideology. Despite the privilege of his family background, Guevara's early life was marked by instability due to his father's chronic illness, which would eventually lead to his death when Guevara was still a teenager. Guevara's family, particularly his mother, played a critical role in shaping his intellectual development. His mother, Celia, was known for her independent spirit and her encouragement of her children to pursue knowledge. She was also a woman of great social conscience, which likely influenced Guevara's sense of social justice. Although he was often in poor health during his childhood, suffering from asthma, which caused him to be physically fragile, he had a precocious intellect. His early education focused on a wide array of subjects, including history, literature, and philosophy, providing him with a broad understanding of the world and sparking his interest in political thought. Guevara's initial encounters with social inequality occurred during his youth. His travels through Argentina, particularly to rural areas, exposed him to the stark contrast between the urban upper classes and the vast poverty experienced by the rural population. The disparity between the two would deeply affect Guevara, planting the seeds for his future revolutionary vision. This was not merely a matter of seeing poverty from a distance. Guevara personally witnessed the harsh living conditions of workers, peasants, and indigenous communities who were often exploited and disenfranchised. It was during this time that his political consciousness began to take shape, moving beyond theoretical ideas and into a deep commitment to fight for social justice. The fact that Guevara came from a middle-class background allowed him access to education and opportunities that many of his peers lacked. However, it was his sense of empathy for those who were oppressed and his desire to understand the root causes of their suffering that led him to challenge his own privileged status. While his peers might have been content with their social positions, Guevara sought answers to the injustices he saw in the world. His exploration of Marxism and left-wing ideologies during his teenage years provided him with the intellectual framework to understand the world's inequalities. However, it was not until his travels across Latin America that he found the motivation to turn his intellectual curiosity into political action. In the early 1950s, Guevara embarked on a life-changing journey across South America with his friend Alberto Granado, a medical student. The trip, which took them from Argentina through Chile, Peru, and other countries, gave Guevara first-hand experience of the poverty and exploitation that afflicted the continent. This journey would come to be known as the Motorcycle Diaries, a title derived from the motorcycle they used to travel. The trip exposed Guevara to the systematic injustices that were entrenched in the region. Poverty, disease, and political oppression were rampant, while the elite remained largely indifferent to the suffering of the masses. This experience deepened his Marxist beliefs and convinced him that the struggle for social justice could not be left to chance. It had to be a revolutionary effort. Guevara's medical training also played an important role in shaping his future revolutionary path. His study of medicine exposed him to the widespread malnutrition, lack of health care, and appalling living conditions of much of the population. While he initially sought to alleviate some of these problems through direct medical care, his growing disillusionment with the limitations of simply treating the symptoms of social ills led him to conclude that true change could only come from systemic political change. He realized that revolution was necessary not just to treat the poor, but to fundamentally alter the structures that kept them in a perpetual state of poverty. Despite his medical background, Guevara was not interested in pursuing a career that would keep him confined to a hospital or private practice. He viewed his medical knowledge as a tool to understand the structural inequalities of society, not as a way to merely heal individuals within a broken system. His worldview was increasingly shaped by the notion that the medical profession, in its traditional form, could not address the root causes of social problems. It was during this time in the early 1950s that Guevara's philosophical transformation took full form as he began to see himself not as a healer of individuals, but as a potential agent of change for the entire Latin American continent. By the time Guevara was in his mid-20s, his political ideology had fully coalesced. He had read widely about Marxism, socialism, and revolutionary theory, but it was not until he encountered the situation in Latin America that he fully grasped the need for armed struggle. Guevara became convinced that the only way to achieve social justice in Latin America was through the violent overthrow of the ruling classes. He came to believe that nonviolent means were insufficient in addressing the deeply entrenched systems of oppression. This understanding would guide his future actions, as he would later dedicate his life to armed revolutions and the spread of socialist movements throughout Latin America and beyond. In 1951, Ernesto Guevara embarked on a transformative journey that would alter the course of his life and shape his future as a revolutionary figure. Alongside his friend, Alberto Granado, a biochemist, Guevara set out from Buenos Aires on a dilapidated motorcycle named La Poderosa, the Mighty One. Their goal was to travel across South America, to see the continent in all its vastness, and to experience firsthand the social and political realities that had been festering beneath the surface of everyday life. The journey lasted almost 9 months and covered over 8,000 kilometers, taking them through Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela. This trip, immortalized later in Guevara's memoir, The Motorcycle Diaries, became the crucible in which his social conscience was forged. The journey began in the midst of Argentina's spring, and for the two young men, it promised to be an adventure of freedom and self-discovery. However, the realities of the road were harsh and unrelenting. Their motorcycle, which quickly proved unreliable, became both a symbol of their naivety and their resilience. Frequently breaking down, it forced Guevara and Granado to interact with the local populations for assistance, pushing them into the depths of rural Latin America, far from the relative comforts of urban life. It was here, among the poor and disenfranchised, that Guevara began to witness the extent of social inequality that would later fuel his revolutionary fervor. In the small towns and villages, Guevara observed the stark contrast between the affluent few and the impoverished majority. He encountered indigenous workers toiling in conditions of extreme hardship, their labor exploited by foreign and local elites. These early observations struck a deep chord in him, awakening a growing sense of empathy for the oppressed. Through these interactions, Guevara realized that the exploitation and suffering he saw were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, systemic problem that affected millions across the continent. These encounters marked the beginning of his realization that social change could not be achieved through mere charity or reform. It would require a fundamental, revolutionary shift. One of the most pivotal moments during the journey occurred in the city of Santiago, Chile, where Guevara and Granado worked for a short time at a leper colony. The colony was situated on a small island, isolated from the rest of the population. The conditions were harsh, and the people who lived there were marginalized, rejected by society due to their disease. Guevara's time at the colony exposed him to the sheer inhumanity of how the poor, the sick, and the marginalized were treated by society. His experience here cemented his belief that society had to undergo a radical transformation to alleviate such suffering, as well as the realization that he could not remain detached from the people he encountered. He began to see the struggle of the poor as a personal responsibility, one that would define his life's purpose. The journey also took Guevara and Granado into the heart of the Andes, where they encountered the stark and rugged landscapes that defined much of South America's terrain. The physical challenges of crossing these vast, unforgiving mountains gave Guevara time to reflect on the injustices he had witnessed. His mind turned increasingly toward the socio-political structures that kept the people of Latin America in such dire straits. He came to see the ruling classes, whether they were landowners, multinational corporations, or political elites, as complicit in maintaining these conditions. Guevara's reflections during these long stretches of road marked the evolution of his political ideology as he began to view the continent's problems through the lens of Marxist theory, realizing that the struggle for justice required more than just empathy. It required action. Perhaps one of the most profound experiences of the journey occurred in the Peruvian city of Cuzco, an ancient Incan capital. There, Guevara saw firsthand the staggering poverty that plagued the indigenous people, many of whom lived in shanty towns on the outskirts of the city. The indigenous populations were often denied basic rights and access to healthcare, education, and employment, further deepening the inequality within the country. As Guevara wandered through the streets, interacting with the poor and disenfranchised, he was struck by their resilience, but also by their powerlessness in the face of such systemic oppression. It was here that he began to conceptualize a new vision of justice, one that was not confined to the narrow borders of charity, but was grounded in the belief that systemic change was necessary to address the root causes of inequality. By the time Guevara and Granado reached the coast of Venezuela, their journey had begun to take on a more urgent tone. The initial sense of adventure had been replaced by a deep, existential understanding of the widespread social injustice that infected the entire continent. The contrast between the wealthy elite and the suffering masses were more glaring than ever, and Guevara's empathy began to transform into a burning desire for revolutionary change. The young medical student, once an observer of the world's injustices, now saw himself as a participant in the global struggle for social justice. He could no longer ignore the call to action, as he understood that true change required confronting and overthrowing the structures that perpetuated inequality. In Venezuela, Guevara witnessed firsthand the political volatility that was sweeping the region. The government was weak and unstable, and the country was rife with corruption. Here, Guevara encountered a group of workers who were fighting for better conditions, and he was moved by their courage. However, he also saw the limits of their struggle, realizing that while protests and strikes could raise awareness, they were insufficient to dismantle the deeply ingrained systems of power. This realization marked a turning point in Guevara's thinking, as he began to understand that the liberation of Latin America could only be achieved through armed revolution. The road from Venezuela back to Argentina, which had initially seemed like an end to their adventure, became a symbolic return to a new way of thinking for Guevara, a return to a commitment to actively participate in the global struggle for social justice. The Motorcycle Diaries was not just a chronicle of a journey across South America. It was the beginning of Guevara's transformation from a young idealist to a committed revolutionary. The experiences he gathered on the road, his encounters with the oppressed, and his exposure to the social and political realities of Latin America profoundly altered his worldview. Guevara came to understand that the world was divided not only by geography, but by deep economic and social divides. And it was this understanding that would propel him into the ranks of the revolutionary movements that sought to change Latin America and, ultimately, the world. The journey across South America, documented in the Motorcycle Diaries, had a profound effect on Ernesto Guevara. Upon his return to Argentina in 1952, he found himself deeply shaken by the contrasts he had witnessed throughout the continent. The glaring inequality, the widespread poverty, and the indifference of the political and economic elites. His medical training had given him a perspective on the physical suffering of the poor, but now his travels had awakened him to the root causes of that suffering, the systemic political and economic structures that perpetuated inequality. Guevara knew that merely providing medical care to the poor was not enough. Real change would require dismantling the forces that created and sustained poverty. This realization marked the beginning of Guevara's radicalization. Guevara's understanding of social issues became more deeply rooted in Marxist theory, which he had been introduced to during his youth, but never fully embraced until his experiences in South America. The idea that social inequality and exploitation were not just personal misfortunes, but were systematically enforced by capitalist structures resonated with him. Guevara came to view the capitalist system as an inherently exploitative force, with the bourgeoisie profiting from the labor of the proletariat. His medical background, which focused on the individual's physical and mental well-being, was soon replaced by a broader concern for societal health. the structural inequalities that left entire populations vulnerable to exploitation and suffering. In 1953, Guevara left Argentina for a brief stint in Guatemala, which would prove to be an important chapter in his ideological development. At the time, Guatemala was undergoing a political transformation under the leadership of President Jacobo Arbenz, a reformist who sought to implement progressive social and land reforms. Guevara arrived in Guatemala just as the government was implementing measures to reduce the power of foreign corporations, particularly the United Fruit Company, which had a significant grip on the country's economy. Guevara became increasingly involved with local intellectuals, activists, and leftist organizations, including the Communist Party, and began to understand the dynamics of anti-imperialist struggle. This period deepened his conviction that revolution was necessary to combat the entrenched forces of capitalism and imperialism that dominated Latin America. However, Guevara's time in Guatemala was cut short in 1954 when the CIA-backed coup overthrew Arbenz government. The coup was a decisive moment for Guevara, one that cemented his belief in the need for armed struggle. The overthrow of a democratically elected government by external imperialist forces was a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play in Latin America. Guevara had already seen the economic exploitation of the region's working classes, but now he saw the geopolitical aspect of the struggle, the way in which the United States and other imperial powers intervened to protect their economic interests at the expense of Latin American sovereignty. This event was the final push for Guevara to fully embrace the idea that only a radical, revolutionary response could counter the foreign domination and systemic injustice that plagued the region. After the coup in Guatemala, Guevara's path led him to Mexico, where he would cross paths with Fidel Castro and the group of Cuban exiles who were planning to overthrow Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Guevara's ideological evolution had brought him to a crossroads. He was no longer just an observer of the inequalities of Latin America. He was now a participant, someone who believed that the injustices he had witnessed could only be rectified through direct action. In Mexico, Guevara met Castro and his brother Raúl, and after a series of conversations, he was convinced that their plans for revolution were the right course of action. Guevara's radicalization had reached a peak, and he committed himself fully to the Cuban cause. The Cuban revolutionaries were preparing to wage guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime, and Guevara, with his medical training and revolutionary zeal, was determined to join the effort. His decision was not purely pragmatic. It was also deeply ideological. Guevara saw in Cuba the possibility of sparking a broader revolution across Latin America. He was convinced that Cuba, with its history of political instability and the harshness of the Batista dictatorship, could serve as the catalyst for an entire region's awakening. He saw the Cuban Revolution as more than just a local struggle. It was part of a larger, global struggle against imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism. His commitment to this cause was unshakable. He was willing to put aside his personal comfort, his medical career, and any previous life plans in favor of this larger revolutionary project. In the guerrilla camp in Mexico, Guevara immersed himself in the teachings of Marx, Lenin, and other revolutionary theorists, further solidifying his commitment to armed struggle. He learned the rudiments of military strategy and tactics, preparing for the day when he would join Castro's forces in Cuba. Guevara, though a novice in military affairs, quickly gained the trust of Castro and became one of the most important members of the revolutionary group. His ability to think strategically, his ideological commitment, and his discipline in organizing and training the guerrilla forces made him a key figure in the eventual success of the Cuban Revolution. Guevara's growing sense of militancy was rooted in his analysis of Latin America's political and economic systems, but it was also shaped by a deeper moral imperative. He believed that the suffering he had witnessed was not just a consequence of systemic injustice, but an urgent call to action. To Guevara, the poor, the exploited, and the oppressed could not wait indefinitely for change. Revolution was not a distant possibility. It was an immediate necessity. This sense of urgency permeated his thinking and would later define his approach to revolutionary action. For Guevara, revolution was not merely an ideological exercise or a strategic endeavor. It was a moral imperative, a fight for the very survival and dignity of millions of people who lived under conditions of extreme injustice. In Mexico, Guevara's radicalization reached its final form. He had moved beyond the ideas of a medical student, a traveler, and a political observer to become a committed revolutionary. His experiences in Guatemala, combined with his encounters with the Cuban revolutionary movement, crystallized his belief that the only solution to the problems facing Latin America was revolution, armed struggle that would overthrow the existing regimes and replace them with governments that represented the interests of the working class and the oppressed. Guevara's transformation from an idealistic young man to a hardened revolutionary was complete. His commitment to the Cuban cause would take him to the heart of Latin American politics and into the pages of history as one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century. In 1956, Ernesto Guevara's life took a decisive turn when he, along with Fidel Castro and a group of revolutionaries, set sail from Mexico to Cuba aboard the yacht Granma. The plan was simple yet audacious: to overthrow the brutal dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, who had ruled Cuba since 1952. Guevara, having fully embraced the revolutionary cause, saw the Cuban Revolution not just as an opportunity to topple a dictator, but as a moment to ignite a broader, continental struggle against imperialism, social inequality, and injustice. It was in Cuba that Guevara would come into his own as a revolutionary leader, forging a reputation that would eventually spread far beyond the island. The expedition began with tragedy. Shortly after disembarking from the Granma, the revolutionary group, which numbered around 82 men, was ambushed by Batista's forces. The early days of the insurgency were marked by harrowing defeats. Many of the revolutionaries were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors, including Guevara, retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they began to regroup, train, and plan their next move. These early setbacks, however, were not enough to break the spirit of the insurgents. Instead, they became a crucible that would forge the strength and resolve of the revolutionary movement. The mountains of the Sierra Maestra became Guevara's new home, and it was there that he proved himself to be not only a capable guerrilla fighter, but also an essential figure in the strategy and leadership of the revolution. Despite his lack of military experience, Guevara quickly adapted to the challenges of guerrilla warfare. His ability to think strategically, his discipline, and his unyielding commitment to the revolutionary cause made him an invaluable member of the movement. He took on various roles, organizing supplies, coordinating attacks, and even treating wounded fighters, his medical training becoming crucial in the harsh, isolated conditions of the mountains. One of Guevara's key contributions to the Cuban Revolution was his emphasis on the importance of gaining the support of the local peasantry. He understood that the revolution would not succeed unless it was able to resonate with the people of Cuba, especially the rural poor, who had long been neglected and oppressed by both Batista's regime and the wealthy elite. Guevara actively sought to establish connections with the local farmers and laborers, gaining their trust by demonstrating that the revolution was not a movement of foreign ideologues, but one rooted in the struggles of the Cuban people. He believed that the success of the revolution depended on the active participation of the masses, and he worked tirelessly to win the hearts and minds of the Cuban people. As the revolutionaries gained momentum, Guevara emerged as one of the central figures in the leadership of the guerrilla movement. He was appointed to command a group of fighters in the eastern part of the island, and under his leadership, they achieved several key victories against Batista's forces. Guevara's role as a military strategist became evident during these battles. He was able to effectively organize hit-and-run attacks, utilize the element of surprise, and capitalize on the weakness of the enemy. His knowledge of Marxist theory, combined with his hands-on experience as a guerrilla fighter, enabled him to lead his troops with both ideological clarity and military effectiveness. One of the defining moments of Guevara's leadership came during the Battle of Santa Clara in December 1958. The battle marked a turning point in the Cuban Revolution and was one of the decisive victories that led to the eventual collapse of the Batista regime. Guevara's forces, though though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, executed a daring attack on the city's military garrison. The use of strategic guerrilla tactics, including surprise ambushes and the disruption of supply lines, allowed Guevara's forces to overpower Batista's troops. The victory was symbolic not only of the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare, but also of Guevara's growing reputation as a fearless and capable leader. The fall of Santa Clara, coupled with other revolutionary successes, led to the eventual retreat of Batista's forces from Havana on January 1, 1959. The victory of the Cuban Revolution was not only a testament to the power of guerrilla warfare, but also a confirmation of the ideals that Guevara and his comrades had fought for: social justice, land reform, and the end of imperialist domination. Guevara, now firmly established as a hero of the revolution, was appointed to several key positions within the new government, including the role of the head of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform. However, Guevara's vision for post-revolutionary Cuba was far from conventional. He was not content with simply achieving victory over Batista. He believed that the revolution was an ongoing process, one that required radical social and economic change. Guevara quickly became one of the most vocal advocates for the implementation of socialist policies in the newly formed Cuban government. His ideas were often uncompromising, emphasizing the need for collectivization, state control of the economy, and the distribution of land and wealth to the poor. Guevara's unrelenting push for radical reforms, however, put him at odds with some of his fellow revolutionaries, particularly those who sought a more moderate path. Guevara's commitment to building a socialist society in Cuba went beyond economic policy. It was a vision for creating a new kind of citizen, one who was not motivated by personal gain, but by the collective good. Guevara believed that the success of the Cuban Revolution depended on the development of a new man, a person who would embrace the values of solidarity, equality, and selflessness. This vision was deeply rooted in Guevara's Marxist ideals, but it also reflected his personal beliefs about human dignity and the need for social transformation. He sought to inspire others through example, working tirelessly for the revolution and living a life that was in stark contrast to the materialism and self-interest he saw in capitalist society. Despite the triumph of the revolution, Guevara's time in Cuba was not without its challenges. The tensions between different factions of the revolutionary leadership grew as Guevara's uncompromising stance on socialism clashed with the more pragmatic approaches of other leaders. His role in the Cuban government began to shift, and he soon found himself moving away from the central administration in Havana. Guevara's dissatisfaction with the pace of revolutionary change led him to seek new challenges, which would later prompt his departure from Cuba and his eventual pursuit of revolutions in other countries. The Cuban Revolution, however, remained a defining moment in Guevara's life. It was there that he rose to prominence, solidified his ideological commitment to Marxism and socialism, and developed the tactical expertise that would guide his future endeavors. Guevara's experience in Cuba marked the culmination of his ideological transformation, from a young medical student and traveler into a revolutionary leader. His role in the Cuban Revolution would serve as the foundation for his future campaigns and his enduring legacy as one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. As the Cuban Revolution solidified and the new government, led by Fidel Castro, began to take shape, Ernesto Guevara's role evolved from a guerrilla leader to a key figure in Cuba's post-revolutionary political landscape. Despite his instrumental contributions to the success of the revolution, Guevara's vision for Cuba's future was increasingly at odds with the broader geopolitical realities of the Cold War. The young revolutionary had come to view the Soviet Union, with its Marxist-Leninist government, as a natural ally in Cuba's fight against imperialism and capitalism. However, Guevara's experience in Cuba's early years would expose the tensions between his idealistic goals and the realities of Soviet-style socialism, ultimately leading him to diverge from Soviet influence. The Cuban Revolution, with its defiant anti-imperialist stance, quickly caught the attention of the Soviet Union. In the early years following the revolution, the Soviet Union was eager to foster a close relationship with Cuba, both as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere and as a way to challenge the growing dominance of the United States in the region. Guevara, as a central figure in the Cuban government, became a strong advocate for aligning with the Soviets, seeing their Marxist-Leninist ideology as an essential part of the global struggle against capitalist and imperialist forces. He viewed the Soviet Union as a potential model for Cuba's own socialist transformation, particularly in terms of its centralized economic planning and emphasis on state control. However, as Guevara became more deeply involved in Cuba's economic policies, he began to see the limitations of the Soviet model. He was struck by the bureaucratic inefficiency and rigid centralization of the Soviet system. Guevara believed that revolution was not just about replacing one form of dictatorship with another. It was about transforming the very nature of society and human relations. He envisioned a decentralized, worker-controlled economy, where the people were directly involved in decision-making and the social structures encouraged collective responsibility and solidarity. Guevara's ideal was a more direct form of socialism, one that focused on the moral transformation of the individual and the collective, rather than on the administrative and economic structures imposed by the Soviet model. This divergence in outlook became evident in Guevara's role as head of the Cuban National Bank and Minister of Industry. While the Cuban government under Fidel Castro was focused on industrialization and aligning more closely with Soviet economic practices, Guevara's priorities were different. He favored agrarian reform, and his belief in the need for a more equitable distribution of land was at odds with the Soviet model, which focused heavily on heavy industry. Guevara also criticized the growing dependence on Soviet aid, particularly the reliance on Soviet resources and trade, arguing that it would only further entrench Cuba's position as a satellite state of the Soviet Union. For Guevara, true independence could only be achieved if Cuba's economic model was rooted in self-sufficiency and direct participation by the people in all aspects of economic life. One of the more controversial aspects of Guevara's economic vision was a strong emphasis on voluntarism and the creation of the new man. Guevara believed that Cuba's socialist experiment was about more than just material wealth. It was about creating a society based on moral values of selflessness, discipline, and collective effort. He was critical of the consumerist mentality that had pervaded capitalist societies and sought to promote a culture of sacrifice and communal responsibility. This idealistic vision clashed with the realities of economic planning, as many Cubans found themselves grappling with scarcity, shortages, and the practical limitations of implementing such radical reforms. Guevara's ideas were considered utopian by many within the Cuban government, particularly as the island faced growing economic difficulties exacerbated by the U.S. trade embargo. While Fidel Castro largely aligned with the Soviet Union, Guevara's criticisms of Soviet economic practices grew more pronounced. His belief that Cuba needed to forge its own path to socialism, free from Soviet influence, led him to call for greater independence in both political and economic matters. This position brought him into conflict with Soviet-backed Cuban officials who were eager to maintain the support of Moscow, especially in the face of continued U.S. hostility. Guevara's critiques were increasingly seen as a threat to the delicate balance of Cuba's foreign relations, particularly as tensions between Cuba and the United States escalated throughout the 1960s. Guevara's disillusionment with Soviet-style socialism reached its peak when he traveled to the United Nations in 1964, representing Cuba on the global stage. At the UN, Guevara gave a powerful speech that underscored his commitment to revolutionary struggle and the global fight against imperialism. However, his speech also reflected his growing dissatisfaction with Soviet foreign policy, particularly the USSR's reluctance to support revolutionary movements in Africa and Asia in the same way they supported Cuba. Guevara's frustration with the Soviet Union's cautious approach to global revolutionary struggle led him to criticize their reluctance to support armed uprisings against colonial and imperial powers. Guevara, ever the idealist, believed that the revolution should be an unyielding force, spreading across the globe and igniting the flames of resistance in every oppressed nation. Guevara's ideological tensions with the Soviet Union were not just confined to economic and political matters. They also encompassed his vision of global revolution. He viewed the Cuban Revolution as a beacon for other revolutionary movements around the world, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Guevara was deeply committed to the idea of permanent revolution, believing that the struggle against imperialism and capitalism was a global one that required continuous action and sacrifice. His experiences in Cuba had shown him that revolution was not a single event, but an ongoing process that required the active participation of the people. However, his growing rift with the Soviet Union made it increasingly difficult for Guevara to promote his vision of worldwide revolution, as the Soviet Union's more cautious, diplomatic approach to foreign policy contrasted sharply with his belief in armed struggle and revolutionary violence. By 1965, Guevara's dissatisfaction with the direction of the Cuban Revolution and his growing isolation within the government led to his departure from Cuba. He left behind his position as the head of the Cuban National Bank and his role in the Ministry of Industry, choosing instead to pursue revolutionary causes in other parts of the world. His departure was a symbolic moment, signaling the end of an era for Guevara and his relationship with the Cuban government. While Fidel Castro's Cuba remained firmly aligned with the Soviet Union, Guevara's departure marked the beginning of his efforts to spread revolution to other parts of the world, particularly in Africa and Latin America, where he believed the struggle against imperialism was far from over. Guevara's decision to leave Cuba was rooted in his growing disillusionment with the limits of Soviet-style socialism and his belief that the revolution needed to be continuously fueled by the aspirations of the people. His time in Cuba had solidified his commitment to revolution, but it had also shown him the limits of the path he had once believed would lead to true liberation. The influence of the Soviet Union, which had initially seemed like a natural ally in the fight against imperialism, had become a constraint on Guevara's vision of a global, unyielding revolution. His journey would now take him into new and dangerous territories, where he would seek to reignite the fires of revolution and inspire the oppressed people of the world to rise up once more. In 1965, after his disillusionment with the direction of the Cuban Revolution and the growing tensions with Soviet-style socialism, Ernesto Guevara left Cuba for an ambitious and dangerous mission: to spread the revolutionary struggle to Africa. His journey was motivated by his belief in permanent revolution and his desire to ignite uprisings against imperialism and colonialism across the global South. Guevara, deeply influenced by his earlier experiences in the Cuban Revolution, sought to apply the lessons he had learned in Cuba to a continent still reeling from European colonial rule and the oppression of local populations. Africa, with its long history of colonial subjugation and ongoing struggles for independence, represented a perfect setting for Guevara's ideal of a global, continuous revolution. Guevara's first stop on the African continent was the Congo, then Zaire, where he joined forces with the rebel movement led by Laurent Desire Kabila. Kabila and his followers were engaged in a violent struggle against the dictatorial regime of Mobutu Sese Seko, who had seized power in 1965 with U.S. backing. Guevara, ever the revolutionary strategist, believed that his experience in guerrilla warfare could help train and guide the Congolese rebels in their fight. He hoped to use the Congo as a launching point for the spread of revolutionary fervor across the continent. He viewed Africa's liberation as crucial to the global fight against imperialism, and his presence was intended to inspire a new wave of insurgent movements across the continent. However, Guevara's experience in the Congo would prove far more challenging and disappointing than he had anticipated. The Congolese rebel forces were poorly organized, divided, and lacked the discipline and cohesion required for successful guerrilla warfare. Guevara, whose leadership had been crucial in the Cuban Revolution, found himself struggling to impose order and unity on the disparate factions within the rebel movement. Despite his best efforts, the mission faltered. Poor communication, a lack of adequate resources, and the inefficiency of the local leaders led to a series of setbacks that eroded Guevara's initial optimism. His dream of bringing about a widespread revolution in Africa through this venture slowly crumbled as the Congolese forces failed to gain any significant traction against Mobutu's well-armed and organized military. One of the key factors that undermined Guevara's efforts was his underestimation of the complexities of African geopolitics. The Congo was a patchwork of different ethnic groups, tribes, and political factions, many of which were more interested in local power struggles than in any broader revolutionary cause. Guevara's desire for a unified, disciplined revolutionary force clashed with the fragmented political reality on the ground. Additionally, the support that he had hoped to garner from neighboring African countries was limited, as many African leaders were either unwilling or unable to commit to his cause. The political and logistical difficulties proved insurmountable, and by the end of the year, Guevara was forced to abandon the Congo mission. Despite the failure in the Congo, Guevara remained resolute in his belief that Africa was a critical front in the fight against imperialism. The experience did, however, alter his approach. He now recognized that Africa's struggles could not be reduced to a one-size-fits-all model, and that each nation and region had its own specific set of challenges that needed to be addressed. His time in the Congo reinforced the idea that revolutions were never easy or linear processes, and that even the most well-laid plans could fail due to a host of unpredictable factors. After the collapse of his efforts in the Congo, Guevara returned to Cuba, disheartened but not defeated. He was critical of the failure, but he did not see it as a reason to abandon his global revolutionary mission. He understood that his time in Africa had provided him with valuable lessons, not just in military tactics, but also in the limitations and nuances of international solidarity. It was clear to him that any future revolutionary movement in Africa would require a deeper understanding of local conditions and stronger, more reliable alliances. Guevara remained firmly committed to the idea that revolutions were a necessary and continuous process, not just in Cuba, but across the globe. Although the African experience was marked by failure, it was also transformative for Guevara. His views on global revolution were crystallized further, and he began to refine his understanding of the complexities of supporting insurgencies in diverse regions. He realized that revolutionary movements in the Third World needed more than just military support. They needed robust, sustainable networks of solidarity and support that could address the economic, political, and cultural needs of the people. For Guevara, the revolution was never just about armed struggle. It was about transforming society from the ground up, reshaping not only political structures, but also the social fabric of the oppressed. The failure in the Congo did not deter Guevara from his commitment to the cause of international revolution. He remained convinced that the struggle against imperialism and colonialism was far from over, and that it would require constant effort and sacrifice to achieve meaningful change. As he returned to Cuba and reflected on his experiences, he began to shift his focus to other regions of the world, particularly Latin America, where he felt the struggle was more aligned with his vision of permanent revolution. Guevara would later prepare for his next major venture, this time into Bolivia, where he believed the revolution could once again gain momentum and spread the flames of change throughout the continent. The African expedition, however, was not only an experiment in revolutionary theory, but also an emotional and intellectual test for Guevara. His optimism, shaped by his success in Cuba, was challenged by the harsh realities of global revolution. The failures in the Congo taught him that revolutionaries could not simply transplant a successful model from one place to another. Each struggle required its own unique strategy, shaped by the people, their history, and their conditions. Guevara had always seen revolution as a moral imperative, but the realities of his African mission revealed to him the complexities of leading a revolution in a world still defined by deep divisions, global inequalities, and entrenched political power. Nevertheless, Guevara's commitment to revolution remained unshaken. Despite the setbacks, the Congo experience solidified his belief that the oppressed people of Africa and Latin America deserved nothing less than total liberation from imperialism. Guevara's experience in Africa was a formative one, not just in terms of his strategic approach to revolution, but in his own personal evolution as a revolutionary leader. It was clear to him now that the path to liberation was fraught with difficulty, but also that the struggle was far from over. In 1966, Ernesto Guevara embarked on what would become the most challenging and ultimately tragic chapter of his revolutionary journey. After his disillusionment with the Soviet model of socialism and the failures of his African expedition, Guevara set his sights on Bolivia, a country in South America he believed was ripe for revolution. His aim was to spark a movement that would unite the oppressed peasants and workers of Latin America and lead them to overthrow imperialism and capitalism. Guevara's conviction was unwavering. The revolution he had fought for in Cuba could spread throughout the continent. Bolivia, with its large indigenous population and deep-seated economic inequalities, seemed like the perfect place to test his theories once more. Guevara's decision to enter Bolivia was driven by his firm belief that Latin America was the key to global revolution. He envisioned a continental uprising where the people of Latin America could rise together against U.S. imperialism and the capitalist systems that exploited them. Bolivia, situated in the heart of the continent, represented a critical focal point in Guevara's plan. With its vast, underdeveloped rural regions and a population suffering from poverty, Bolivia seemed to offer the potential for a successful insurgency. Guevara saw himself as the catalyst that would ignite this change, just as he had done in Cuba. The Bolivian campaign began in relative secrecy. Guevara, under the alias Carlos, arrived in Bolivia in late 1966 with a small group of Cuban fighters. They established a base in the rugged countryside in the hope of gaining the support of the local campesinos, peasants. However, unlike in Cuba, where Guevara's guerrilla movement had found support among a united group of revolutionary forces, Bolivia's social and political landscape was fragmented. The peasant communities, many of whom were indigenous, were deeply suspicious of the revolutionaries. The country had a history of military coups and unstable governments, and local people were wary of outsiders, especially those who came with promises of revolution. Furthermore, Guevara's focus on military struggle and the imposition of a Marxist ideology did not resonate with the daily concerns of many Bolivians, who were more concerned with survival than with abstract political ideas. Guevara quickly realized that the conditions in Bolivia were far more difficult than he had anticipated. His efforts to rally the peasants were met with resistance, and the lack of support made it difficult to build the momentum needed for a successful insurgency. The Bolivian army, with support from the United States, was well-equipped and highly trained, and they were determined to crush the uprising. Guevara's small force was continually harassed by the army, and it soon became clear that the revolutionary movement lacked the resources and manpower to sustain itself. This imbalance of power was compounded by the terrain, which was both harsh and difficult to navigate, and by Guevara's underestimation of the complexities of Bolivia's social dynamics. Despite these challenges, Guevara's determination did not waver. He believed that revolutionary struggle was an inevitable process, one that required sacrifice, even in the face of overwhelming odds. His role as a leader remained central, but as the campaign dragged on, the rebels faced increasing difficulties. The logistical problems of securing food, medical supplies, and ammunition were compounded by a lack of local knowledge and the isolation of the guerrilla fighters. Guevara's idealism, once a source of strength, began to clash with the harsh realities of guerrilla warfare in a country that did not share the same revolutionary fervor as Cuba. Guevara's efforts to forge alliances with local insurgent groups and labor movements were largely unsuccessful. His reliance on an armed, militaristic approach to revolution alienated potential allies who sought more gradual political change. Moreover, the internationalist nature of Guevara's mission did not resonate with the Bolivian government or the broader public, many of whom viewed him as an outsider rather than a liberator. In this sense, the Bolivian campaign marked a stark contrast to Guevara's earlier successes, where local populations had rallied behind his leadership. His foreign revolutionary zeal was seen as irrelevant in a country where the struggle for social justice was often defined by local issues rather than ideological battles with imperialism. Guevara's health began to deteriorate as the campaign wore on. The guerrilla fighters were isolated, unable to receive sufficient medical attention, and the lack of proper nutrition took its toll. By late 1967, Guevara's forces were fragmented and demoralized. The army, with the help of U.S. military advisors, had begun to close in on his group, and internal divisions among the fighters began to emerge. Guevara's attempts to reorganize and launch new offensives met with limited success, and his once unshakable belief in the inevitability of revolution was starting to give way to the harsh reality of failure. However, Guevara refused to abandon his cause, pushing his remaining fighters to keep up the struggle, even as their numbers dwindled. The final blow to Guevara's campaign came in October 1967. After a series of intense skirmishes, Guevara's remaining forces were surrounded in the remote village of La Higuera, located in the foothills of the Andes. On October 8th, Guevara was captured by Bolivian troops, with the assistance of CIA operatives who had been tracking his movements. His capture was swift and decisive, marking the end of the revolutionary campaign in Bolivia. Guevara, exhausted, wounded, and isolated from his comrades, was taken into custody. His capture would become a symbol of the failure of his final mission, but also of his undying commitment to the cause. In the days that followed, Guevara was interrogated by the Bolivian army. His fate was sealed when he was executed on October 9, 1967, in the small schoolhouse in La Higuera. His death was swift and brutal, and the world would soon learn of it through news reports and photographs that would immortalize his legacy. His execution was meant to serve as a warning to others who might follow in his footsteps, and his body was displayed publicly as a symbol of the state's victory over revolutionaries. However, rather than quelling the revolutionary fervor, Guevara's death inspired a new wave of idealism and resistance, particularly among young radicals around the world. Guevara's final days in Bolivia were marked by a resolute commitment to his vision of revolutionary struggle, even in the face of failure and imminent death. His campaign had ultimately been doomed by logistical challenges, lack of local support, and the overwhelming force of the Bolivian army. Yet, Guevara's belief in the necessity of armed struggle and his dedication to the cause remained unwavering, even in the final moments of his life. The Bolivian campaign was a tragic and poignant end to his revolutionary journey, but it underscored the intensity of his commitment to the principles of Marxism and his unrelenting pursuit of global liberation. Ernesto Guevara, even in death, became an enduring symbol of revolution and resistance, his name and image etched into the history of Latin America and the world. The iconic photograph of his face, taken by Alberto Corda in 1960, quickly became one of the most recognized images of the 20th century. Guevara's legacy, however, is as complex and multifaceted as the man himself. To some, he is a hero, an uncompromising figure who sacrificed his life in the name of justice, equality, and the liberation of oppressed peoples. To others, he represents the dangers of ideological purity, the violence of guerrilla warfare, and the authoritarian aspects of revolutionary movements. Guevara's influence spread far beyond the jungles of Cuba and the mountains of Bolivia. His life and death became a rallying cry for various revolutionary movements around the globe, from the anti-colonial struggles in Africa to the student uprisings of the 1960s. The image of Che Guevara, with his beret and defiant gaze, was adopted by revolutionaries, activists, and even those who simply admired his spirit of rebellion. His image adorned posters, T-shirts, and graffiti, becoming a universal emblem of resistance against imperialism, capitalism, and oppression. His words, written in his diaries and speeches, continue to inspire generations of people who believe in the necessity of radical social change. Yet, the widespread admiration for Guevara has also sparked deep criticism. For many, his vision of revolution was too rigid, his belief in armed struggle too absolute. Guevara's insistence on the necessity of guerrilla warfare as the primary means of achieving revolutionary change led to his support for violent uprisings in countries where the conditions for successful revolution were not always present. His disdain for political moderation and his suspicion of those who advocated for gradual change created a rift between him and other leftist movements. Guevara's revolutionary methods were not only divisive, but often led to harsh consequences for those who followed his call. His time in Cuba, for instance, was marked by his involvement in the country's post-revolutionary purges, where perceived enemies of the state were executed or imprisoned. Guevara's execution of prisoners, most notably during the Cuban Revolution, remains one of the most controversial aspects of his legacy. While he justified these actions as necessary for the survival of the revolution, many critics argue that his actions bordered on authoritarianism and violated basic human rights. His uncompromising stance on violence, even in the face of his own ethical contradictions, casts a shadow over his reputation. To some, Guevara's idealism was irreconcilable with the realities of state power, which often necessitates compromise and pragmatism rather than blind adherence to ideological purity. Beyond his violent methods, Guevara's economic ideas also attracted criticism. As Minister of Industry in Cuba, Guevara sought to implement a system of radical economic transformation based on central planning and a rejection of consumerism. He pursued policies aimed at creating a self-sufficient, socialist economy, but his vision was not fully realized. His economic policies often clashed with the practical realities of managing an economy, especially in a country like Cuba, which faced economic isolation and scarcity due to the U.S. embargo. Guevara's economic theories, particularly his emphasis on the moral value of work over material incentives, were seen by some as unrealistic, and his departure from Cuba in 1965 was, in part, due to his frustration with the country's economic trajectory under the Soviet model. Despite the controversies surrounding his actions and ideas, Guevara's influence continued to grow after his death. His commitment to fighting imperialism resonated deeply in a world where many countries were still under the sway of colonialism or neo-colonial economic systems. Guevara's writings on the necessity of permanent revolution and his critique of global capitalism have been studied and debated by scholars, activists, and politicians alike. His call for the unity of the global South against imperial powers has found a lasting echo in movements advocating for economic and political independence from Western powers, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Guevara's legacy also extends into the realm of cultural and political iconography. The Che image became ubiquitous, far beyond the revolutionary circles that originally embraced it. From protests in the 1960s to modern-day political rallies, Guevara's face remains a symbol of defiance, used by people from all walks of life. However, his image has also been commodified, turned into a product that can be sold and marketed worldwide. The irony of this commercialization is not lost on critics, who see it as a betrayal of Guevara's anti-capitalist ideals. To wear a t-shirt with Che's face, some argue, is to miss the deeper, more radical aspects of his revolutionary ethos, reducing him to a mere fashion statement rather than a figure of political substance. Guevara's influence also lives on in the political movements he inspired. Left-wing guerrilla groups and revolutionary movements across the globe, from Latin America to the Middle East, have invoked his legacy as they seek to overthrow what they see as oppressive regimes. His calls for armed struggle and revolutionary violence continue to resonate in some quarters, though many modern leftist movements have distanced themselves from Guevara's approach in favor of more democratic and nonviolent methods. Yet, Guevara remains a powerful figure in the popular imagination, a symbol of radical idealism and resistance against entrenched power structures. In the decades following his death, Guevara's life has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, films, and academic studies. His legacy has been interpreted and reinterpreted in various ways, depending on the political and cultural climate of the time. For some, Guevara remains a martyr who gave everything for the cause of social justice. For others, he's a cautionary tale of the dangers of uncompromising revolutionary zeal. His life and death continue to provoke debate about the efficacy and morality of revolutionary violence. the role of leadership in social change, and the complex dynamics of political power. In the years since Guevara's execution, the political landscape of Latin America has shifted, but many of the issues he fought for, social justice, the end of imperialism, and the liberation of oppressed peoples, remain central to the struggles of the region. Guevara's ideas about economic independence and social transformation continue to inform left-wing politics, even as his methods are scrutinized. In Cuba, where he once played a central role in the revolution, Guevara's memory is both venerated and contested. While his image still adorns the streets and monuments of Havana, his legacy is debated within the Cuban government, which has embraced a mix of socialism and market reforms that Guevara himself may not have supported. Ernesto Guevara's impact on revolutionary thought and practice was not confined to his military exploits or his role in Cuba's post-revolutionary government. His intellectual legacy, articulated through his writings, has endured as a crucial component of his broader contribution to leftist movements worldwide. Guevara's texts are a mixture of personal reflections, theoretical musings, and practical guidance, offering a window into his revolutionary mindset. These writings, particularly his diaries, letters, and essays, provide insight into the motivations, aspirations, and contradictions that shaped his life and work. One of Guevara's most famous works is his Motorcycle Diaries, a chronicle of his travels across South America with his companion, Alberto Granado, in the early 1950s. This book captures the essence of Guevara's initial awakening to the social injustices that pervaded the continent. As a young medical student, Guevara was moved by the poverty, exploitation, and inequality he encountered, experiences that deeply shaped his later commitment to revolutionary struggle. In his diary entries, Guevara reflects on his growing awareness of the social and economic conditions that oppressed millions of people, and these early observations laid the foundation for his later political convictions. The Motorcycle Diaries is not just a travelogue. It is a window into the evolution of Guevara's revolutionary ideology. The journey across South America exposed him to the brutal realities of poverty, disease, and economic exploitation that were rampant in the region. Guevara wrote about the indigenous populations living under harsh conditions, the exploitation of workers in mines, and the lack of basic health care in rural areas. These observations of systemic injustice fueled his belief that Latin America needed a radical transformation, one that could only come through revolution. His writings from this period reflect a deepening sense of empathy for the suffering of ordinary people, which would later become central to his vision of armed struggle. Guevara's intellectual development was also shaped by his study of Marxist theory, which he encountered while living in Mexico during the mid-1950s. In Guerrilla Warfare, his most significant theoretical work, Guevara articulates his vision for revolutionary armed struggle. The book is a manual for guerrilla fighters, offering a practical guide to conducting revolutionary warfare in rural settings. Guevara believed that the success of a revolution depended not on the size or strength of the armed forces, but on the mobilization of the masses, particularly the rural peasantry, who he argued were the true agents of revolutionary change. His writings on guerrilla warfare emphasize the importance of creating the nucleus of the new society within the guerrilla movement, which would eventually expand to include workers, peasants, and other disenfranchised groups. Guerrilla warfare is also notable for Guevara's exploration of the psychological aspects of revolution. He wrote extensively about the need for revolutionary leaders to inspire the people, to establish trust with the masses, and to lead by example. Guevara's theory of guerrilla warfare was grounded in his belief that a small, committed group of revolutionaries could ignite a larger movement, provided they had the support of the people. This was a radical departure from traditional military strategy, which relied on conventional warfare tactics and overwhelming force. Guevara's emphasis on the role of the peasantry and his belief that revolutionary change could only come through a combination of political consciousness and armed struggle set his work apart from other Marxist theorists of the time. In his writings, Guevara also addressed the moral and ethical dimensions of revolutionary violence. He was unflinching in his belief that armed struggle was necessary to overthrow imperialism and capitalist oppression. However, he did not glorify violence for its own sake. Rather, he viewed it as a means to an end. For Guevara, the goal of revolution was the creation of a more just and egalitarian society. While he recognized the inherent brutality of war, he believed that revolutionary violence was justified when used to combat systems of exploitation and oppression. This belief in the necessity of violence, however, has been a source of controversy, especially in the context of Guevara's role in the Cuban Revolution, where he oversaw the execution of prisoners and dissenters. Another key aspect of Guevara's writings is his critique of Soviet-style socialism. After his departure from Cuba in 1965, Guevara increasingly distanced himself from the Soviet Union, which he saw as an imperialist power in its own right. In his letters and speeches, Guevara criticized the bureaucratic nature of the Soviet system and its tendency to prioritize state power over revolutionary ideals. He believed that the Soviet Union had lost sight of the true goals of Marxist theory, which for Guevara was not merely the consolidation of state power, but the creation of a truly socialist society based on human liberation. His rejection of Soviet-style socialism was a central theme in his writings, particularly his later essays, where he called for a more radical, grassroots approach to revolution. Guevara's writings also delve into the dynamics of class struggle and the role of the intellectual in revolutionary movements. In the Bolivian Diary, a collection of notes and reflections written during his final months in Bolivia, Guevara reflects on the complexities of leading a revolution in a foreign country, far from the support networks and resources that had sustained his earlier efforts in Cuba. He wrote about the challenges of building alliances with local communities and the difficulties of maintaining discipline within his guerrilla band. The Bolivian Diary is filled with personal struggles and moments of doubt, revealing a side of Guevara that is often overlooked in more idealized portrayals of his life. Despite the setbacks, Guevara's writing in this period reflects his unwavering commitment to the cause of revolution. One of the most poignant aspects of Guevara's writing is the sense of personal sacrifice that runs throughout his work. In his letters, particularly those addressed to his children, Guevara expresses a deep sense of love and longing, even as he commits himself to the revolutionary cause. His correspondence with his family and friends often reveals his inner conflict between his role as a revolutionary leader and his desire to be a father and a husband. These letters humanize Guevara, offering a glimpse into the personal costs of his commitment to revolution. The tension between his personal life and his ideological commitments is a recurring theme in his writing, highlighting the emotional and psychological toll that revolutionary struggle took on him. Guevara's writings also contain a strong element of moral idealism. He was driven by a vision of a better world, one free from exploitation and injustice. His belief in the moral imperative of revolution is evident in his assertion that revolutionaries must be willing to sacrifice everything, including their lives, in the pursuit of justice. For Guevara, revolution was not merely a political or economic process. It was a deeply moral endeavor, one that demanded selflessness and total dedication to the cause. His writings, particularly his reflections on the role of the revolutionary in society, emphasize the importance of moral clarity and personal integrity in the struggle for social change. Guevara's writings have continued to influence political thought long after his death. His ideas on guerrilla warfare, revolution, and the role of the peasantry have been studied and debated by scholars and activists around the world. His critique of Soviet-style socialism has resonated with those who seek alternative models of socialist thought that emphasize grassroots participation and direct action. Guevara's commitment to armed struggle and his belief in the necessity of revolutionary violence remains central to his legacy, even as his writings are used to support a wide range of political movements, from Marxist-Leninist groups to anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist organizations. Ernesto Guevara's life came to an abrupt and tragic end on October 9, 1967, in the remote hills of Bolivia, but his impact continues to reverberate across the world. His death marked the culmination of his lifelong commitment to revolutionary struggle, though it also marked a poignant moment of disillusionment for many of his followers. The years leading up to his death had been marked by profound ideological shifts, personal struggles, and an increasingly complex relationship with the revolutionary causes he had once championed with unquestioning zeal. As Guevara lay in a small shack, his hands bound and his body weakened from days of capture and combat, his life was reduced to a tragic irony. A revolutionary icon whose mission had been crushed by the very forces he sought to defeat. Guevara's final days began when he entered Bolivia in 1966, with the aim of sparking a revolution in a country he believed was ripe for change. Disillusioned with the state of affairs in Cuba and the perceived bureaucratic drift of the Cuban government, Guevara sought to build a new base of revolution. His decision to take the struggle to Bolivia came from his belief that Latin America as a whole had to be liberated, not just Cuba, and he felt compelled to spread the ideals of revolution across the continent. He had envisioned Bolivia as the cradle of the second wave of revolutions in Latin America. Unfortunately, the conditions in Bolivia were not as favorable as Guevara had hoped. The peasantry, which he considered the backbone of any successful revolution, did not respond as he had anticipated, and Guevara's forces were hampered by a lack of popular support and the difficult geography of the region. As Guevara and his band of guerrillas waged a desperate campaign in the mountains and jungles of Bolivia, they found themselves increasingly isolated, both from the local population and from their fellow revolutionaries. Guevara's personal conviction remained steadfast, but his hopes of sparking a continental revolution began to fade. His tactics, which had worked in Cuba, were no longer effective in Bolivia. The Bolivian army, trained by the United States in counterinsurgency methods, relentlessly pursued Guevara's small group, and the CIA, aware of his presence, provided logistical support to the Bolivian forces. Guevara's optimism, his belief in the strength of revolutionary ideals, proved to be a tragic miscalculation in the face of such overwhelming opposition. On October 8, 1967, Guevara was captured by Bolivian forces near the village of La Higuera after a firefight that left several of his comrades dead. He was taken to a small schoolhouse in the village, where he was interrogated and held prisoner. The next day, under orders from the Bolivian government, Guevara was executed without trial. The news of his death was greeted with mixed reactions. To his supporters, Guevara was a martyr who had given his life for the cause of justice and revolution. To his detractors, his death was the inevitable result of his uncompromising ideology and the failure of his guerrilla campaign. Guevara's last moments, as described by his captors and others who were present, remained shrouded in myth and controversy. Some accounts suggest that Guevara faced his death with dignity, while others portray him as defiant to the end, refusing to beg for his life. In the wake of his death, Guevara's body was secretly buried by the Bolivian government. It wasn't until 1997, decades later, that his remains were discovered and returned to Cuba, where they were interred with full honors in a memorial in Santiago de Cuba. His return to Cuban soil symbolized the completion of a circle. Guevara had fought for Cuba's revolution, and it was in Cuba that he would ultimately rest. This act of posthumous recognition further solidified Guevara's status as a symbol of revolutionary heroism, but it also raised questions about the nature of martyrdom, the use of his image, and the idealization of his life and death. Guevara's death, however, did not bring an end to the reverence and controversy surrounding his legacy. In the decades following his assassination, his image was appropriated, debated, and reinterpreted across the globe. His commitment to armed struggle and revolutionary change found a new audience among the youth of the 1960s and 1970s, particularly within the context of anti-colonial movements, anti-Vietnam War protests, and the broader counterculture. His face, often displayed on posters and T-shirts, became synonymous with resistance to imperialism, capitalism, and authoritarianism. The fact that Guevara had sacrificed his life for the cause of the oppressed made him a martyr in the eyes of many, further cementing his place as an icon of revolution. Yet, Guevara's image has also been commercialized, leading to criticisms from some of his former supporters and detractors alike. The commercialization of Che, his image reproduced on consumer goods, from t-shirts to coffee mugs, has sparked debates about the contradictions inherent in the commodification of a figure who opposed capitalism. For some, Guevara's image has become an empty symbol, disconnected from the radical ideals he espoused. This paradox highlights the tension between Guevara's revolutionary legacy and a modern capitalist world that continues to trade in images of resistance and rebellion for profit. The Cuban government, which Guevara had once served, has had a complex relationship with his legacy. While the state honors him as one of the central figures of the Cuban Revolution, Guevara's vision for a truly socialist society went beyond the government's current policies. Guevara was a fierce critic of the Soviet Union and the bureaucratic nature of state socialism, and his advocacy for a more decentralized, grassroots model of socialism has often been overlooked in favor of a more institutionalized version of socialism in Cuba. Despite this, Guevara's legacy remains enshrined in Cuban society, where he is remembered as a revolutionary martyr who fought for the independence and dignity of the Cuban people. Outside of Cuba, Guevara's influence has persisted in the global South. His advocacy for the oppressed and disenfranchised resonates with many left-wing movements, particularly those in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which continue to confront the challenges of imperialism, poverty, and social injustice. Guevara's revolutionary ideals have inspired a new generation of activists who see in his life a commitment to fighting against entrenched power structures. However, his legacy is not without its critics, particularly those who view his belief in armed struggle and violence as problematic, especially in today's world where nonviolent movements have gained prominence. In the academic world, Guevara's life and writings have become the subject of extensive scholarly analysis. Historians and political theorists have studied his writings, his role in the Cuban Revolution, and his failed attempts to spread revolution to other countries, trying to understand the complexities of his thought and the consequences of his actions. Some view Guevara as an idealistic visionary, while others see him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of revolutionary extremism. His writings on guerrilla warfare, class struggle, and the nature of imperialism continue to shape discussions about revolutionary theory and practice. The legacy of Ernesto Guevara is a complex and contradictory one. He remains a symbol of resistance and revolution for millions around the world, a figure whose life was defined by his uncompromising commitment to justice, equality, and the liberation of the oppressed. Yet, his methods, particularly his embrace of violence and his authoritarian tendencies, have sparked ongoing debate about the morality of revolutionary violence and the nature of true liberation. Guevara's life, death, and legacy serve as a reminder of the profound challenges and contradictions inherent in the struggle for a better world. His story continues to provoke reflection, criticism, and admiration, ensuring that Ernesto Che Guevara remains a figure whose influence will be felt for generations to come.